Evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. It's Tuesday, the 24th of May. My name is Brian Liddy and I've got a rare treat today. We're actually joined live in the studio. Oh, I'm sorry, I've said the 24th of May. It's the 14th of May. Forgive me, I'm getting ahead of myself. But I've got a rare treat. We're joined live in the studio today by William.
Yes, yes, today, not on the 24th.
Yes.
On the 14th, absolutely. One digit out, not bad. Nice to be here.
Thank you, William. And William, you're a writer and activist with Perth Kinross Yes Hub.
Indeed.
And I'm a great supporter of Broadcasting Scotland, for which we thank you. But without further ado, let's have today's Ukraine update. And today is day 811. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Kyiv today in the first visit to Ukraine by a senior US official since Congress passed a long-delayed $61 billion military aid package in April. US officials said on Monday they were working to speed up delivery of that aid to the front line. The US Department said Blinken would meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukrainian officials to discuss battlefield updates, the impact of new US security and economic assistance, long-term security and other commitments, and ongoing work to bolster Ukraine's economic recovery. Ukrainian officials said only a few hundred residents remained in the northeast town of Vovchansk outside Kharkiv amid pitched battles. Russia was attacking new areas with small groups to try to widen the front and stretch Ukrainian forces. Russia's forces were driving towards Vovchansk, about 5 kilometres or 3 miles from the Russian border, as well as Liptsy, north of Kharkiv, Regional Governor Oleh Syniehov said. Ukraine's troops were trying to establish themselves at a meat plant on the outskirts of Vovchansk. About 5,700 people were evacuated from in and around the town, and roughly 300 remaining were being urged to leave. The Ukrainian army acknowledged Russia was achieving tactical success after launching its Kharkiv ground assault on Friday. Ukraine's Security Council chief Alexander Litvinenko said Moscow had mounted tens of thousands of troops against the Kharkiv region. There are a lot of Russians, quite a lot. About 50,000 were on the border. Now there are much more than 30,000 coming. That was a quote. On Monday evening, a missile hit Korotych, a settlement near the city of Kharkiv, killing a 38-year-old man and injuring 3, police said. Earlier attacks injured a 71-year-old woman in Liptsy and a man aged 69 in the town of Izium, the governor said. Ukraine launched drone strikes on western Russia, hitting an oil terminal in the Belgorod border region and an electrical substation in the Lipetsk region. Rockets struck the Luhansk region of eastern Ukraine under Russia's control, according to Moscow-appointed Governor Leonid Paschik. Ukraine's security services, the SBU, said it thwarted a Russian operation in Kyiv to set off bombs disguised in packages of tea in builders' markets and a car bomb outside a cafe. A defence enterprise in the western city of Lviv was also a target. 2 Russian military agents were detained on suspicion of involvement and 19 explosive devices were seized, the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's official said. Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office said, The US State Department called it a sign of desperation after the Russian President Vladimir Putin removed his veteran defense minister Sergei Shoigu and replaced him with a top economic official, Andrei Belousov. William, fairly lengthy report there today. Anything that you'd like to highlight?
Well, obviously the visit of Antony Blinken is very important here. Now that the big aid package from the US has been approved, it's a case of speeding it up. And I know that the Americans had plans to front load it a little bit and to get some of the hardware over as quickly as possible. And no doubt Antony Blinken will be working on that because the military situation at the minute does appear to be that Russia has been steadily gaining ground for a little while, and now Kharkiv is pretty much under threat, and we're getting to the places just around Kharkiv and all sorts of activity going on there. And it's really quite important from Ukraine's perspective that they get the military resources that will enable them to hold out and to repel some of that, and maybe to get something approaching the upper hand in the war going forward. But things are on a bit of a knife edge at the moment, and very difficult to predict quite what will happen next and how effective Antony Blinken will be in speeding up that aid.
Okay, thank you, William. And so now we move on to the latest from Israel and Gaza. At least 35,173 Palestinians have been killed and 79,061 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. The Biden administration has assessed that Israel has amassed enough troops on the edge of Rafah to move forward with a full-scale incursion on the southern Gazan city over the coming days, CNN reported. Two senior administration officials also told the outlet that US officials are unsure if Israel has made a final decision to carry out the full SC. Israeli tanks forged deeper into eastern Rafah today, reaching some residential districts of the southern border city where more than 1 million people had been sheltering. Witnesses reported seeing tanks crossing the strategically important Salah al-Din. I'm not sure what happened there, if that was just a glitch in the studio, but let me go back a bit just in case. So witnesses reported seeing tanks crossing the strategically important Salah al-Din road into the Brazil and Janea neighbourhoods. Between 360,000 and 500,000 Palestinians have fled Rafah in the past week after Israeli warnings to evacuate eastern and central neighbourhoods. Médecins Sans Frontières said that it had been forced to stop providing healthcare at Rafah Indonesian Field Hospital as of Sunday. MSF said the 22 patients who remained at the hospital have been referred to other facilities as MSF can no longer guarantee their safety. A spokesperson for the UN Aid Agency for Palestinian Refugees, Louise Waterridge, who is in Rafah, wrote in a post on X that families still in the southern city had moved as far west as possible, describing inland in the city as a ghost town. One of Action Aid's partners in Rafah, WIFAC, has paused humanitarian operations there, with the charity warning that aid operations could grind to a complete halt as aid workers face an unprecedented level of danger, making their jobs become impossible. The charity says that aid workers in Rafah are experiencing the same inhumane living conditions as the rest of the population, and that virtually no aid has entered Gaza in recent days. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, said it would hold hearings on Thursday and Friday to discuss a request by South Africa seeking new emergency measures over the Rafah incursion, which Qatar says has stalled efforts to reach a ceasefire. South Africa's demand is part of a case it brought against Israel, accusing it of violating the Genocide Convention in Gaza, and which Israel has called baseless. The White House has condemned an attack on an aid convoy heading to Gaza by Israeli settlers who threw packages of food into the road and set fire to vehicles. UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron said attacks on aid convoys headed for Gaza were appalling and that Israel must hold those responsible to account. So, William, again, the same question. Was there anything there that you'd like to highlight?
It's all bad and it's all disastrous just at the moment. The Rafah incursion is well underway. Israel may or may not have decided on what it would term a full-scale assault on Rafah, but it's definitely happening. Meanwhile, ceasefire talks are right off the table. Whatever may be going in Qatar to restart them, that is the reality of it. And at the very same time, hospitals are struggling and aid is just not getting into Israel. More than that, it's being blocked by settlers. And it's all very well for David Cameron to say Israel must hold those responsible to account. I very much doubt that Israel will be doing very much of that, despite all the words of its spokespeople that this is the most carefully constructed and humane destruction of a territory that we've ever seen. The world should be shocked by this, and we haven't seen the end of it yet. And we can talk about genocide, we can talk about ethnic cleansing and all these emotive terms that Israel and its government rail against us doing. But what is certainly happening, in my view, is a humanitarian catastrophe, and it may now be too late to stop that.
Thank you, William. And when you were talking about Ukraine, you mentioned Anthony Blinken, but I think he's also this week used the words anarchy and chaos to describe what's going on in Gaza. And he talked about fear of a power vacuum, which Netanyahu might be able to take advantage of. I don't know did you catch any of that? Or
I didn't catch that. But in terms of a power vacuum, I take it, do you mean a power vacuum in Gaza. After Hamas has been swept away? I'm assuming that that's what happened, which is a very difficult thing for them to achieve, I might add. Netanyahu will certainly want to try to put that to his advantage. What happens after hostilities cease? And that may be a long way away. They could be talking about a war of attrition after the destruction that we've seen. But what happens afterwards is a big question, not just for Israel and for the Palestinians, but for the world. Because we have to make sure that after 76 nearly years of just horrific violence breaking out from time to time and now at its zenith, we need something that will bring peace with justice to that part of the Middle East and indeed to the whole Middle East. I don't see anybody at the minute talking about that sort of thing in any meaningful way. But if we cannot continue like this, we simply can't.
No major breakthroughs. So the next item is sub-postmasters wrongly convicted as a result of the faulty Horizon IT system will automatically be exonerated under proposed legislation introduced to the Scottish Parliament today. Those whose convictions are quashed under the Post Office Horizon System Offences Scotland Bill will then be able to access the UK Government Financial Redress Scheme. The bill's passage through the Scottish Parliament will be expedited to allow justice and redress to be delivered to victims as swiftly as possible in line with the UK bill, which was not extended to cover sub-postmasters in Scotland. If passed, the Post Office Horizon Systems Offences Scotland Bill will mean relevant convictions are automatically quashed on the day the legislation comes into force, and those exonerated will then be able to access the UK Government Financial Redress Scheme in line with its requirements. The legislation will exonerate convicted sub-postmasters where the following criteria are met. The conviction was for embezzlement, fraud, theft, uttering an ancillary offence committed between the 23rd of September 1996 and the 31st of December 2018. If the person was carrying on a post office business or working in a post office for the purpose of a post office business. If the conviction was in connection with carrying on or working for the post office for the purpose of the post office business, or if the Horizon system was being used for the purposes of the post office business in the relevant post office, or if the conviction has not been considered by the High Court in connection with an appeal. Justice Secretary Angela Constance said, innocent sub-postmasters had their lives ruined by being wrongly convicted of offences of dishonesty on the evidence of the faulty Post Office Horizon system. The quickest, easiest route to overturn these miscarriages of justice would have been for the UK government to extend their Post Office Horizon System Offences Bill to cover sub-postmasters in Scotland. However, our repeated requests for this were refused. Our bill therefore mirrors that of the UK legislation to ensure parity for affected sub-postmasters in Scotland with those elsewhere in the UK and to ensure access to the UK government's compensation scheme. She went on to say the scale of the scandal and the length of time that the victims have waited for justice means we are taking an unprecedented step to introduce legislation to right this terrible wrong and asking Parliament for it to be processed as an emergency bill. The Scottish Government will not do anything to jeopardise equality and parity for victims, so the final stage of the bill cannot be considered in the Scottish Parliament until after the UK legislation has been passed. This will ensure that MSPs can take account of any amendments made to the UK bill. William, could this be a rare instance where Holyrood would be happy, or would have been happy, to let Westminster legislate on its behalf, because it would have made sense, wouldn't it, to get payments out or redress out to the folk who deserved them, if Scotland had been included in the bill, just as Northern Ireland and Wales have been. I mean, why wasn't Scotland included, do you think?
I think possibly a bit of naughtiness on behalf of Westminster just to make life difficult because, Wales and Northern Ireland were included, other devolved administrations, but not Scotland. Now, of course, in Scotland, the prosecuting authority was not the Post Office, so there's a technical thing there, and that is the stated reason, I think, why Scotland wasn't simply included in the UK legislation. So Scotland, as a result, is inevitably playing catch-up. It'll be quite close behind the UK legislation, but it has to wait until the UK legislation is actually passed because who knows what amendments will come in that the Scottish legislation needs to take account of. However, I think they've made good progress considering, and the more important thing afterwards is the UK compensation scheme, and I'm glad that the Scottish bill will ensure equality of access to that scheme, and one just has to hope that that scheme is as fast as it possibly can be in assuring redress, because obviously it's absolutely vital that the postmasters are exonerated. Their convictions were clearly unsafe, and it's a great tragedy that some did not live to see their exoneration. But more importantly, financial redress. These people have lost a lot of money, and they didn't need to because basically a wrong was being done to them. And if you look at the dates on the Scottish legislation, we're looking at a 22-year period when wrong was being done to them. So vital they get proper redress for that. Some of them really put in financially straitened circumstances as a result.
Thank you, William. You're right to mention that people have lost their lives already. And again, I think if I was a Scottish postmaster or postmistress, if that's the right phrase, in Scotland, I would be quite nervous to know that Holyrood was going to have to wait for Westminster before it could act. And this bill hasn't been passed yet. It's going to be debated later in the month and voted on at the end of May. But will this help put people's minds at rest, do you think?
I think the Scottish Government is probably doing enough to make it clear that they've got the postmaster's interests at heart. And I do believe that the legislation will be passed. I'd be very surprised if it's not unanimous in Holyrood, that it will be passed as soon as humanly possible after the Westminster legislation is through. And at that point, automatic exoneration. So that's stage one, that very, very important stage. Then I'm afraid it's over to the UK compensation scheme, and looking at how long it's taken to unravel other scandals, I have my doubts about that one. But let's get this thing over with first. Let's get the exoneration done.
One stage at a time. Thank you. In January to March 2024, Scotland's unemployment rate estimate for people aged 16 and above was 4.4%. The employment rate estimate for people aged 16 to 64 years was 73.1%, and the inactivity rate estimate for 16 to 64-year-olds was 23.4% in the same period. HMRC early estimates show 2.45 million payrolled employees in Scotland in April 2024, and that's 6,000 more than a year ago. Commenting on the latest labour market statistics, Economy Secretary Kate Forbes said, "It is positive to see that HMRC early estimates published today show 2.45 million payrolled employees in Scotland in April 2024. That's 6,000 more than a year ago. However, today's data also reflects the ongoing challenges facing our economy, including the cost of living crisis, and is why we are investing more than £5 billion to grow and transform Scotland's economic landscape." She went on to say that Scotland is open for business, and the Scottish Government is committed to working hand in hand with business to use the limited powers of devolution to help more people into work through employability and skill support. She went on to say that the economic opportunities for Scotland are huge. Yesterday, the First Minister welcomed major investment in Ardersier Port, while today work will begin on Sumitomo's high-voltage cable plan in the Inverness and Cromarty Green Freeport. Both these developments, supported by the Scottish Government, demonstrate how we are becoming a renewable powerhouse and turning opportunities into jobs. So, William, there's another big development. The Gibson's Engineering is about to reopen what was the St Rollox depot just on the edge of Glasgow, known as the Calais. It's a new engineering facility that's going to allow the site to once again play a prominent role in transforming the railway engineering industry in the UK down the line. So that's another example that wasn't maybe mentioned in the report. But is it fair to say that Scotland isn't, based on these figures, that Scotland isn't a sick note nation or should be exempt from the fact that Rishi Sunak recently described the UK as a sick note nation? Does this show that Scotland's kind of avoided that?
Well, Scotland's economy would normally be, if you look at regional comparisons, probably the third or fourth best performing region in the UK. Scotland has never been a basket case as it's portrayed. So I'm not surprised to see that the labour market statistics are holding up and that things are beginning to move in a positive direction. St Rollox is certainly one. And it'll be interesting now to see how Kate Forbes performs in the role of Economy Secretary. I'm not sure I'm entirely on board with everything that she supports. I'm not that keen on free ports, to be honest with you, although the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. But certainly she's been given that as her basic main brief, as well as being Deputy First Minister, to show what she can do. So now is her opportunity to drive that forward and to make the most of what potential there is. And there's still some way to go, that's true. But certainly this is a fairly encouraging set of figures. And let's just hope that they are early statistics, which means, of course, they're subject to revision potentially later. Let's hope that doesn't happen in a negative way and that we continue. But another interesting thing that she mentions in the statement is the limited powers of devolution. And the Scottish Government has to keep driving this home. We can't do everything we need to do to boost the economy until we have the full powers of independence.
And just that figure of 2.45 million, I mean, that's almost half of the population of Scotland. I mean, obviously it's not going to include babies and toddlers and people that are getting on in years and the infirm. But I was quite surprised just at the fact that half of Scotland is actually out there paying their taxes and work. Should I be surprised?
Not really. 4.4% unemployed. It's a fairly small figure. If you add it all together, that's probably pretty reasonable account of the working age population, minus 4.4%.
Okay, thank you. So Gordon Brown has called for a rescue plan for austerity's children, a generation of more than 3 million UK young people born after 2010 from low-income families who have never known what it is like to be free of poverty. Former Labour Prime Minister urged the government to create a multi-billion-pound programme of support for a blighted generation that has grown up under Tory rule amid huge public spending cuts, COVID, the cost of living crisis and the Ukraine conflict. Austerity's children, who account for 3.4 million of the UK's 4.3 million, I'm going to read that again just to make sure I got those figures right. Austerity's children, who account for 3.4 million of the UK's 4.3 million children living below the poverty line, would face extra health, educational and employment challenges as a legacy of the decade-long experiment of fiscal authority, he said. His calls come despite the Labour Party saying that in government they would stick to the Conservative government's fiscal rules and spending limits. The SNP today accused Gordon Brown of having his head in the sand over the scandal of child poverty. The SNP said that First Minister John Swinney has made the eradication of child poverty the defining mission for SNP, unlike Labour. The SNP said they are standing against damaging Westminster policies and taking meaningful action to tackle this scourge on society. Commenting, SNP MSP Colette Stevenson said, "There is widespread agreement across Scotland that one child living in poverty is too many, but the dishonesty of senior Labour Party figures is deeply disappointing." She went on to say that children are suffering as a result of disastrous Tory policies like austerity, Brexit and economic chaos, and yet the Labour Party supports these and has pledged to continue down the road of economic harm and suffering. She went on to say that by sticking to Tory economic orthodoxy and cruel policies like the two-child benefit cap and rape clause, Labour are accepting the suffering these measures are causing, and empty words from Gordon Brown won't change that. William, I can't help feeling that maybe is Gordon Brown being a wee bit hard done by the SNP here, because when he was Prime Minister and when he was part of Tony Blair's Labour government, he had a reputation for bringing down child poverty, didn't he? And this kind of reminds me of earlier this week, I think it was, or maybe late last week, First Minister John Swinney wrote a letter to Keir Starmer offering to invite him to Butte House to talk about working together to bring down child poverty. And as far as I can tell, Keir Starmer hasn't turned up on the doorsteps of Butte House yet. So, and Keir Starmer said that he wouldn't get rid of the two-child cap, but he would make it work more effectively, or it be administered more fairly. Can you make any sense of this? Because I'm struggling.
Well, I can't work out how you make a two-child cap fairer, or how you operate. I call this, and I've done it before, marks for artistic merit, but it isn't going to help children in poverty. I think Gordon Brown does take a lot of flack, but I think he has recognised that there's a problem, and he had recognised that austerity has been really behind that problem, and he's counted out the steps through which that has happened, with the two-child cap being the most recent bad development, that 2017. But I think benefits that are relevant to child poverty are in real terms 20% down on where they were when Gordon Brown left office. And that's a fair statement to make. However, a nice Brown intervention for a change, but I fear that it's got to get past these statements by Labour that they'll stick to the fiscal rules. And whereas I think Gordon Brown is looking at £3 billion of funding, £2 billion of it is coming from getting banks to deposit a fraction of the reserves with the Bank of England for no interest. So that might raise that, but he's also talking about raising a bond for £1 billion. And all of that, if it's raised, will create some of the services that have fallen away as a result of austerity cuts over the years. What he doesn't mention, why should he, because he's not in the Scottish Government, is that the Scottish Government has already made inroads on child poverty to the tune of, I think, 100,000 children by virtue of the Scottish Child Payment, which for those who qualify is £26.70 per child per week. And that has been acclaimed by Professor Danny Dorling and others as something that is making a difference. And it's a more direct way to change child poverty. Gordon Brown would recreate services that have fallen away with all the organisational issues that involves, whereas the Scottish Government is putting money into people's pockets to help them to deal directly with what's facing them. So Gordon Brown wouldn't give the Scottish Government credit for that ever, I'm sure. But I do give Gordon Brown credit for at least recognising the problem. I fear it won't come to much, though, under the Starmer regime to come.
Thank you, William, and certainly I'll be looking with interest to see how Keir Starmer justifies not working with the SNP to bring down child poverty. So I'm sticking with Labour for the next item. Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar has said that Natalie Elphicke would not be welcome in the Scottish Labour Party. Elphicke, who was the right-wing Conservative MP for Dover until her surprise defection last week, is now a member of the Labour Party and sits on the Labour benches at Westminster. On the Good Morning Scotland programme today, Anas Sarwar said that he regarded some of the things Elphicke has said in the past as unacceptable. Asked about her defection, he said, "I don't know Natalie Elphicke, I've never met Natalie Elphicke. Looking at some of the comments that have been attributed to her on what she has said, I find them completely unacceptable. I don't agree with them." Asked if she would have been allowed to join Scottish Labour, he replied, "Well, look, she certainly wouldn't be a Scottish Labour candidate. I can be really clear about that." So, quite a short item there, William. I suppose you can't blame Anas Sarwar for trying to distance himself from Natalie Elphicke, but should he be allowed to distance himself from her?
Well, Natalie Elphicke will not be an MP after the general election, so her time in the Labour Party as I nearly said an elected member, but you know what I mean, a representative in Parliament is going to be short. I suspect that Keir Starmer is quite happy for Anas Sarwar to have this apparent freedom to take a different route in what he's saying from what Keir Starmer is saying, because, you know, there's no harm at the end of the day. It's only a short-term issue. I would think, though, that later on, once Keir Starmer is in power, which he will be, I think, Anas Sarwar will not always be able to find ways to diverge from what Keir Starmer wants to do, and that is going to be a problem that steadily gets worse for him. But I'm glad that Anas Sarwar has said what he said. I don't think she can join Scottish Labour because I don't think Scottish Labour exists, to be absolutely technical. Sorry about that, but there you go. She certainly wouldn't be a Scottish Labour candidate because she won't be a Labour candidate. But that must mean he's more optimistic about being able to find candidates than seems to have been the case lately, when there hasn't been enough talent in Scotland to fill at least 3 seats, because we're relying on candidates who are councillors in London, I think one in Kent, and the chair of the Medical Aid for Palestinians. Not entirely sure if Keir Starmer will be approving of that one. So there is a bit of a talent shortage perhaps in Scottish Labour, but Natalie Elphicke will be irrelevant to that, I'm afraid.
And she is, of course, the second Tory MP to cross. Recently there was another fellow whose name I can't recall. But what do you think about, what does this mean for Anas Sarwar's relationship with Keir Starmer? I can imagine that Anas Sarwar is going to be saying, this is an example of me saying that I'm my own man, I don't have to do what Keir Starmer tells me. But at the end of the day, basically, he can say what he wants on this because Starmer doesn't have to pay him the slightest bit of attention, does he?
I think Starmer will be quite happy for Anas Sarwar to diverge in small, controlled ways that don't have much effect, really, until the election. After that, I wouldn't be so sure. Of course, by then, if the Scottish voters have elected a whole bunch of Labour MPs, it'll be too late to do anything about it.
Okay, thank you for that. So, members of the armed forces are being trained once again to cover for striking border force staff at ports and airports. Dozens of uniformed soldiers have been seen at Home Office facilities in the southeast of England amid concerns that the UK could be able to enter another summer of travel chaos. Training The training is taking place in anticipation of a national ballot of members of the PCS union, which could lead to industrial action at ports and airports across the UK. The action would not include Scotland, but would include England, Wales and Northern Ireland. It is understood that the MOD has received a request for military aid from the Home Office to provide personnel. The use of the armed services to cover striking workers has proved contentious, with senior military figures saying they should not be deployed in civilian duties. So, William, this strikes me as the kind of news that we were told by the likes of David Davis and Lord Frost and the disgraced ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson that just wouldn't happen, that borders would not be an issue. So it's post-Brexit Britain, I suppose. But I'm also intrigued as to, have you any idea why the strike won't apply in Scotland?
Well, Scotland, of course, doesn't have quite as many points of entry as England does. Not that that answers your question in the slightest, but I just thought I'd make that observation. The potential strike is the PCS union, and I don't know what level of representation border force staff in Scotland have got there. The PCS did reach an agreement with the Scottish Government through to 2025 on certain matters, and that may also be relevant here. I suspect that the vast majority of Scottish border force staff are in unions such as Unison, though. So those are all guesses and speculation, but I'm quite pleased that it's not going to apply in Scotland. It's nice to have something working well in Scotland when it's not working well in England. So maybe that's schadenfreude on my part.
And the fact that in recent years Scotland's avoided strikes in like the health sector and I think on the railways because they negotiated with the unions, whereas England and Westminster didn't. Do you think, is there any chance that Westminster will be taking any advice from Holyrood on how to negotiate and avoid a strike?
I'm not convinced that Westminster necessarily wants to avoid strikes the whole time. That may seem strange, but they seem to act with, if not belligerence, then a total lack of understanding about where the unions are coming from. They simply cannot be that bad at negotiating without having some form of ulterior motive, I suspect. And certainly they will never give Scotland the credit for running so comparatively strike-free in so many areas. So the last thing the Westminster government would ever want would be to be seen to be holding Scotland up as a lesson to them.
I mean, you say that they should be able to negotiate, or they shouldn't be that bad at negotiating, but look at how they negotiated with the withdrawal from the EU.
Fair comment, yes. That's where my argument falls to the ground, perhaps. Maybe they are just bad at negotiating. There's certainly a significant difference between the two, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. Riot police used tear gas to disperse protesters outside Georgia's parliament, and MPs brawled inside as a foreign agents bill, condemned as a Kremlin-inspired act of repression, was passed into law today. The bill was backed by 84 MPs to 30, despite Western pressure and the rolling protests that have brought hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets of the capital, Tbilisi. Forgive me. A number of protesters were treated by medics after tear gas was used on a noisy but peaceful crowd of thousands of people, while squads of police dragged some individuals away. The violence spread into the chamber, with a dozen MPs fighting and one MP from the governing Georgian Dream Party being held back by security guards as he violently lurched at the chair of the main opposition, Levin Kabasivi. Under the legislation adopted today, media or civil society groups in Georgia that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad will have to register as organisations serving the interests of a foreign power. The US Department has called the bill Kremlin-inspired, as it has echoes of legislation introduced into the Russian statute books in 2012 by Vladimir Putin, which many people say has been used to silence critics. The billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili is the honorary chair of the ruling Georgian Dream Party and is widely thought to be driving government policies. Ivanishvili made his fortune in Russia and has had $2 billion of his funds frozen by the US. The president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, has said she would veto the law, but the governing party has sufficient numbers in parliament to overrule her. The European Commission today restated its position that the new law would undermine Georgia's application to join the European Union. EU member countries are very clear, excuse me, that if this law is adopted, it will be a serious obstacle for Georgia in its European perspective. So it's maybe worth mentioning that this is the country Georgia, not the state, and it's Southern America. Excuse me, William. Also, we talked about this on the Full Scottish earlier this week on Sunday, and one of our guests, Greg McCara, made the point that this is a kind of legislation that on the surface it looks benign, it just wants to increase transparency, but actually it's a step towards fascism, basically. Do you think Greg's right?
I think he has a point. Certainly, if it's modelled on what Russia was doing in 2012, that's certainly the way in which it was used. But it need not necessarily be, of course, because I'm sure that in an independent Scotland we'd want our media to be overwhelmingly owned by Scottish interests rather than overseas interests, and we would, whether we would go to the extent of legislating, it would certainly be something we'd want to do culturally, and I don't think that would necessarily be a step towards fascism. But in terms of slightly different environment we see in Eastern Europe. Not just Russia, but Viktor Orban in Hungary passed a similar law in 2017. I think it was then struck down by the European Union, but it had similar intent. And I suspect also that Mr. Ivanishvili would be quite pleased if the law that's just gone through led to the failure of Georgia's bid to join the EU. And I think that's what's really getting to people, not just the possibility of fascism, but not joining up with the EU. I think they're quite keen to do that, and that's why there's so much trouble. But if Georgia were to enter the EU, then I suspect that Ivanishvili would not have the freedom in terms of human rights, etc., to do all he might wish to do to secure his grip on the country. And I think that's what's really at stake here. And it's not finished yet, because there will be further riots, even though the law is now in force. Georgia is not a happy place at the moment, and I don't really know how this will resolve itself in the end.
Yes, as you say, there's implications down the line. I think Georgia also wants to join NATO as well as the EU. This the fact that there's been brawling in the chamber, that really isn't going to go down very well in the EU and the NATO. It's kind of almost like signs that you've got a corrupt regime. Do you think? Or
yeah,
that's how it looks, maybe. Or
no, it's not a good optic. It really is not a good optic, and certainly some people in the upper echelons of the EU will be looking at it with horror. Wouldn't be the first time that somebody threw a punch in a parliament or another, but nevertheless, not what you want to see, and not evidence of a happy, democratically healthy society.
Yes, thank you, William. The Scottish Parliament has unanimously approved legislation giving Scottish ministers powers to assess and remediate buildings which have unsafe cladding where consent of the owners cannot be provided. The Housing Cladding Remediation Scotland Bill will allow the creation of a cladding assurance register to give homeowners and residents confidence in the assessment and remediation works undertaken on their buildings. Ministers will also have powers to establish a responsible developers scheme. Excuse me. Ministers will also have powers to establish a responsible developer scheme to support engagement with developers and encourage them to pay for or carry out remediation work. Housing Minister Paul McLennan said, "This is a landmark moment in our efforts to make buildings safer and to safeguard homeowners and residents in buildings identified through the remediation programme as having unsafe cladding." Forgive me, the unanimous passing of this legislation will allow us to accelerate our work by addressing barriers to assessment and remediation and give homeowners and residents confidence in work carried out.
Before you ask your question, drink of water.
No, it's fine, honestly. So, William, this is in the wake of the Grenfell disaster. 72 folk lost their lives there in 2017. We often hear that Scotland and England have got different planning regulations. We often hear that Scotland's regulations are better or higher than England's. But then you'll hear people then say, but Scotland does have buildings with cladding that caused the problems in Grenfell, which I'm sure is true. But hopefully this would help put, as the item said, residents and tenants' minds at rest.
Well, it's an essential step. These buildings that do exist, and I think there are 105 of them have been identified in Scotland. Very little remediation work has happened yet, and that needs to be sped up. In some respects, and I think probably in most respects, England is actually further ahead of Scotland, considerably so. I mean, it's now getting on for 7 years since the Grenfell disaster, and understandably, the Westminster government was very keen to make moves on this as fast as possible. But now Scotland is getting the legislation in place, and now it's time really to get on with it. The next big question is going to be the funding of it, and can that be carried out? Again, we're talking limited resources, limited powers of devolution, but we really need to be getting on with it, because only when a programme of works is seen to be underway will residents and tenants' mind really be put at rest, I think.
Thank you, William. And apologies for interrupting your answer with my coughing and spluttering.
We'll get there. 15
We
minutes.
will, yes. So, forgive me, viewers. Today's rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide increase is 10 times faster than at any other point in the past 50,000 years, according to a new international research led by Oregon State University and the University of St Andrews. A team of international researchers undertook a detailed chemical analysis of ancient Antarctic ice, revealing the stark findings and the impact of human emissions. Studying the past teaches us how today is different. The rate of CO2 change today really is unprecedented, said Kathleen Wendt, an assistant professor in Oregon State University's College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, and the study's lead author. She said, "Our research identified the fastest rates of past natural CO2 rise ever observed, and the rate occurring today, largely driven by human emissions, is 10 times higher. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a greenhouse gas that occurs naturally in the atmosphere. When carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere, it contributes to warming of the climate due to the greenhouse effect. In the past, the levels have fluctuated due to ice age cycles and other natural causes, but today they are rising because of human emissions. Ice that built up in the Antarctic over hundreds of thousands of years includes ancient atmospheric gases trapped in air bubbles. Scientists use samples of that ice, collected by drilling cores up to 2 miles deep, to analyse the trace chemicals and build records of past climate. The US National Science Foundation supported the ice core drilling and the chemical analysis used in the study. Previous research showed that during the last ice age, which ended about 10,000 years ago, there were several periods where carbon dioxide levels appeared to jump much higher than the average. Using samples from the West Antarctic ice sheet divide ice core, Vent and colleagues investigated what was occurring during those periods. They identified a pattern that showed that these jumps in carbon dioxide occurred alongside North Atlantic cold intervals known as Heinrich events that are associated with abrupt climate shifts around the world. These Heinrich events are truly remarkable, said Christo Bizert, an associate professor in the College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences and co-author of the study. The scientists think they are caused by a dramatic collapse of the North American ice sheet. This sets into motion a chain reaction that involves changes to the tropical monsoons, the southern hemisphere westerly winds, and those large burps of CO2 coming out of the oceans. Other research has suggested that these westerlies will strengthen over the next century due to climate change. The new findings suggest that if that occurs, it will reduce the Southern Ocean's capacity to absorb human-generated carbon dioxide. So, William, this is scary stuff, isn't it? I heard someone say that now scientists no longer talk about global warming, they now call it global boiling. So basically, how bad do you think it has to get before people change their lifestyles? I'm thinking even just like plastic bags in supermarkets. You see people queuing up and say, "Do you want a plastic bag?" They say yes, because it's only about an extra 5 pence or 10 pence for a bag. Should something like plastic bags be £5, for example? I mean, that's not the only answer, but something's got to change, surely.
Well, something has got to change. That's certainly true. I think actually at the end of the day, there's not all that much that individuals can do. Governments have got to legislate, and they have got to deal with the consequences of their legislation, because the alternative is too horrific to contemplate. There's been, I think, of late, a note of almost panic in the voice of scientists about what's going on. And you can see why when you see statistics like this. Things are speeding up, and with CO2 and other gases trapped in the ice sheet and the ice sheet potentially melting, we could be looking at a runaway CO2 greenhouse effect situation. And basically, large swathes of the world become uninhabitable if that really happens. Unless the scientific majority is very, very wrong about this, which I don't think they will be, then we have big, big trouble ahead. But, we can ask individuals to perform a bit better with how they deal with plastics, etc., or maybe avoid plastics. But it ain't going to matter much if China's pumping out lots of CO2 and gas-fired power stations, etc. It's the big players have got to make a big effect. And to be honest, I don't see any way that's happening in the short term. Whatever Just Stop Oil and others may do, whatever protests there might be, there just seem to be too many vested interests think they can get away with the way things are without changing things too quickly and kicking the can down the road. And the truth is, we don't actually know how much trouble we're in. Maybe my prophecies of doom are not that realistic, but maybe they are. We just don't know. And that's the truly scary thing.
Yes, it sounds like you're saying that we might have passed the point of no return. So I'm thinking about groups that lobby government, climate deniers, perhaps. I don't know how you would stop that or prevent that happening, make changes to lobbying. The other thing that I'm thinking about is just the impact of climate change. Once it does really start to kick in, then there's going to be mass migration, isn't there, from one part of the globe where perhaps it's flooded to parts of the globe where it isn't flooding. So
mass migration is a strong possibility. I mean, I keep coming out with that line when we talk about asylum seeking and immigration. It is a concern. What will we do if large numbers of people have to move from one place of the world that becomes uninhabitable to others? And that is something that would take a tremendous national and international, I should say, effort. But, the vested interests go on. And that's the real problem. We're now getting to problems where, as a species, we need to do things entirely differently. And I'm not sure at this point we have the capacity to adjust that fast. Of course, the human race is surprised. Well, perhaps surprise isn't the thing, but it's managed big changes in the past. But we're leaving it to the 11th hour, and 11:59, I would suggest.
Do you think there should be something maybe in the United Nations where, like something out of a science fiction movie, where you see every government in the world converging on the United Nations to try and knock heads together and do something globally, as you suggest?
I think many governments might be slightly captured by the vested interests, so the prospect of them doing that would be spectacular to watch if it were to happen, but I don't think it will. We'll just have a succession of COP meetings that get ever more frantic. And maybe sooner or later, big changes will be made, and we won't kick the can quite so far down the road. But will the damage already have been done?
Yeah. I said, how bad does it have to get before people actually do something? And I think it's going to be, it'll be just horrible to contemplate. Yeah, sorry. So our last item is the number of women being tested for breast cancer is at its highest ever level in Scotland. More than 3 in 4 women, that's 75.9%, took up their screening invitations over the 3-year period from 2020 to 2023. Scottish breast screening programme statistics have indicated. This is an increase on the previous 3-year period when uptake was 74.5% and pre-pandemic when the uptake was 72.2%. The figures also show that all NHS boards individually have met the acceptable uptake standards of 70% for a second year in a row. Breast screening is offered to women aged 50 to 70 approximately every 36 months. This is in line with the recommendation from the UK National Screening Committee. Screening was paused between March and August 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. The programme continues to offer appointments at 6 breast screening centres across Scotland, as well as the mobile screening units which allow women in more remote areas to access screening more easily. Women's Health Minister Jenny Minto said, "I am pleased that more women are attending breast screening appointments and that boards have individually met their target for a second year in a row. However, there is more work to be done to reach the achievable target of 80% and to encourage people from more deprived areas to attend their appointments." Forgive me once again. So, William, mentioned in the report there that Scotland has some unique challenges. A lot of people living in rural areas have got to travel a long distance for screenings like these, and yet the figures in Scotland are improving. So, why do you think that might be?
Well, I think NHS Scotland has always risen quite well to the challenges of geography and lack of resource. So there are 6 centres, but there are also mobile units moving about, and that certainly is having an effect. Particularly impressive that we're now ahead of where we were pre-pandemic, because one of the periods in the latest 3-year window includes the pause for a few months in 2020 when the pandemic struck. And whether that just changed the shape of the graph, or whether it actually meant that some people didn't actually come into the screening, I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to see next year's figures, which will take 2020 entirely out of that window. If you do, I think comparisons with England are not always a great idea, but I'll do it anyway. If you look at England, they take figures year by year, but their latest figures are nothing like that good. I think the highest percentage is the southeast of England at 68%. London, by contrast, is 55.8%. So they are, on average, about 12 percentage points down on Scotland. Now, that may not be because NHS Scotland is great and NHS England isn't. It could be things like NHS Scotland is one body with one programme to get the breast screening done, whereas NHS England is now a diverse number of trusts, all of which are kind of operating on their own and maybe thinking slightly differently about how they do things. But I think it's great to see, and I think it's also great to see that in Scotland, Jenny Minto and her colleagues are not resting on their laurels. They're saying, let's go for 80%. It's achievable, and I believe it probably is. And good luck to them.
Thank you, William. I'm hesitating because I don't want to have two men here in the studio. I don't want to be accused of politicising this because it's incredibly important. But you think the differences is between Scotland and England is because health has devolved, and so it's an example of devolution being for the good.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we've decided not to go down the trust route. That's for a start. And I think NHS Scotland tends to make a virtue out of necessity. So it's got a big challenge. It's got limited resources. How will it do it? It'll have more mobile units, for example, than might be the case in England, to make sure you get to these outlying areas, outlying from the central belt, which of course means so much. So yeah, you could say that. But it's just a different way of looking at it. And I think that, NHS Scotland is to be commended. And I think it would go even better in an independent Scotland. But then, of course, I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah, and I suppose it is important to note that to get back to the really important thing, which is to save lives here. And so I would just say that, even men as well, get yourselves checked for whatever parts of your anatomy.
Well, I think the prostate is quite important. And everybody should do bowel screening.
Yes. So I think that that's us for this evening. William, thank you once again, and thank you for taking the effort to come in all the way from Perth. It's really much appreciated. But I suppose you'll have trains to catch and the like. So,
well, I have dinner to have in my wee hotel.
Oh, okay. So you're staying over. That's great. But thank you. So that's it for this evening. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our focus now moves to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. But thank you once again to our guest, William Duguid, for coming in, and thank you for you at home for watching. Good night.